let's talk about the word genocide. It's a heavy one, right? Maybe the heaviest charge you can level in international law. But what does it actually mean when you apply it to a messy modern war? Today, we're going to dive into an academic paper by Shmuel Sperling that takes on this claim directly in the context of the war in Gaza. Now, our goal here isn't to take a side. It's to unpack the arguments in this paper piece by piece so we can all better understand the shape of the debate. So, this huge question, how do you even begin to answer it? Well, the source material we're looking at today says you've got to cut through the noise. It argues you need to focus on three key things: the precise legal definition of the word, the difference between words and actual actions, and what the data really says when you put it in context. Let's start with that first point. Okay, so the first pillar of the paper's argument starts with the word itself. The author claims that the entire debate really hinges on a very specific, and sometimes misleading, interpretation of what genocide even means. Now, this is where the paper's argument gets really interesting. It points out that the legal definition of genocide includes destroying part of a group. But the author argues this creates a kind of logical trap, what they call a red herring. I mean, think about it. Every single war, by its very nature, involves fighting and killing a part of an enemy collective. So the paper asks a really critical question. If we use that definition too broadly, does every nation fighting a war of self-defense automatically become guilty of attempted genocide? All right, so if the definition itself is debatable, the paper then shifts focus to something a bit more concrete: intent. The argument here is that you can't prove genocidal intent with rhetoric alone. You have to look at the actions, the actual deeds on the ground, and see if they match the accusation. And here's the evidence the author presents to back that up. The paper argues there's a huge contradiction between the accusation of genocide and these specific actions. It asks, why would an army with genocidal intent spend so much effort giving advanced warnings for civilians to evacuate? Why would they help transfer food, fuel, and even medical equipment like incubators and ventilators? The source even points to the population growth in Gaza in the years before the war, suggesting it runs completely counter to any narrative of a long-term plan to annihilate the population. This all leads to a really powerful and, pretty provocative quote from the source that sums up this entire line of reasoning. The author concludes that if the goal was in fact genocide, then all the evidence of actions taken to preserve civilian life would make it the greatest failure of a genocide in history. Now we're going to pivot to the third major part of the paper's refutation, and this one is all about the data. The author argues that while the numbers of civilian casualties are, of course, tragic, you can't understand them in a vacuum. You have to analyze them within the specific, brutal context of modern urban warfare. The whole idea here is that raw numbers can be incredibly powerful emotionally, but they can be misleading if you don't have a baseline for comparison. So the paper insists on comparing the situation to other recent conflicts to really evaluate what the data is telling us. Okay, let's actually look at the numbers here. This chart, using data cited from the Modern War Institute, compares the estimated ratio of civilian to combatant casualties. In the Gaza conflict, the ratio is estimated at around 1.5 civilians for every combatant. The paper then contrasts this directly with the Battle of Mosul against ISIS in Iraq, where that ratio was significantly higher, at about 2.5 to 1. The author's conclusion from this data is stark. Far from being evidence of genocide, this ratio is, in the context of modern urban warfare, historically low. This data analysis leads us right into the paper's fourth and final major point: the accusation of a double standard. The author essentially asks why this specific conflict is being labeled a genocide when other conflicts that were, statistically, much deadlier for civilians were not. This table lays out the author's comparison, point by point. On one side, you have the U.S. response to 9/11, a war against a nation on the other side of the world that resulted in an estimated 150,000 civilian deaths in just its first 5 years. On the other side, the Israeli response to October 7th, an attack from an entity right on its border. The paper's core argument here is that despite the vastly higher absolute number of civilian casualties in the Iraq War, widespread accusations of genocide against the U.S. just weren't nearly as common. For the author, this isn't just a small difference. It's evidence of a profound double standard in how these events are judged. And so after laying out these arguments on definition, on intent, on the data, and on double standards, we get to the author's final conclusion. The paper posits that Israel's actions, when you analyze them through this particular lens, should be understood not as genocide, but as a necessary and, in the author's view, moral act of self-defense. And that brings us to the most important question of all, one that goes way beyond this single source. We've just dissected one detailed academic argument, but that's what it is, one argument. In today's world, we are just flooded with narratives from media, from academia, from governments, and every single one has a perspective, a bias, a motive. So the ultimate challenge isn't to find the one source that you happen to agree with, it's to develop the critical tools to question all of them, to scrutinize the data behind the claims, and to resist the comfort of a simple narrative. The goal isn't to be told the truth, it's to build the skills to determine it for yourself.